hotel rooms around the world, 700 million train tickets around the world. So we really pay lots of attention to sustainability for our environment. So we promote 3 R's when we promote our product: reduce, reuse, and recycle, because travel is very essential for the people around the world to enhance cultural exchange, and particularly during this very challenging time where we have COVID, we have global conflicts, different opinions. We feel very passionate that travel can bring people to people exchange very well. But meanwhile, we also need to promote the concept that we need to preserve the sustainability for the environment while we are traveling. So we encourage our customers to take pride in the 3R initiatives: reduce, reuse, recycle. For everything they can bring, they can reuse during their trip. They very proactively are doing so. Secondly, we also work very well with our partners, global partners around the world, such as hotels, to provide green suppliers, for the airlines also to reduce the plastic usage, for attractions to use organic products, so that while people are traveling, we can promote the sustainable environment as well. And certainly, when people are traveling with us, they can donate their loyalty points, such as Trip.com loyalty points, and we will double that. And the points we cumulative will be used to plant the trees in the sandhills in the Mongolians. So far, millions of trees are being planted around the world. So for right now, particularly for the Generation Z, I think the concept of promoting sustainability is very much rooted in their hearts. So I'm very optimistic that going forward, we will have more and more customers joining us, partners joining us, to make sure where they're traveling, sustainability is always in their mind. And I'm very glad that today we have this forum to discuss different initiatives, issues, challenges, and solutions, and promote to our global customers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Sun. Ms. Henry, would you like to go next?
Sure, if I can unmute myself from my attic setting. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. And I'm gonna just share one quickly, one just slide with you all, and then we'll jump right in, because does that working?
Looks good.
Okay, good. So it's a pleasure to be with all of you. My name's Sarah Henry. I'm the Executive Director of a new global Center for Gender Equality at Stanford, and I'm really excited to be here and talk a little bit about especially the SDGs and thinking about new systems and inspiration for achieving them. I just kind of wanted to start with kind of the framing of why does the world need another global center, and why did we believe that gender equality was one of the fundamental catalytic levers to actually achieving the SDGs, and just a little bit to talk about that we're kind of in this unprecedented moment. I mean, we have the global infrastructure of the SDGs, which is absolutely wonderful, but we also find ourselves in this kind of political, economic health crisis globally, right? Which has completely exacerbated these underlying inequalities in ways that we hadn't seen before, and the ways in which it's going to continue to kind of push the global population and numbers of people into extreme poverty at pretty unprecedented rates. And especially with the kind of also the social movements and the Black Lives Matter movements really putting into a forefront what are these structural inequalities and structural systems, but then also the fundamental nature and necessity to come up with new solutions. The solutions that we have designed, particularly in global health, have been very siloed. We section out the human being and then we design solutions for them, kind of one sector at a time. We meet your reproductive health needs, and then we come along and say, oh wait, you need clean water, or let's talk about infrastructure in terms of roads and bridges. And we need to think about new solutions that fundamentally address the root causes of these inequalities, and was kind of the fundamental founding and ideas behind launching this new center at Stanford. And just to kind of tell you and we're relatively new, meaning we really are we don't even have our webpage up, but the fundamental idea behind what we're trying to do is to really, we believe, and our vision is that we believe in a world where gender equality is seen, valued, and experienced as a basic human right. And we actually see our mission to dismantle these oppressive systems. How do we translate knowledge and practice into action? And kind of how do we inspire change makers kind of in service of global justice? And I think, you know, one of the ways in which we think a lot about this is around taking an intersectional approach to these problems, right? Gender equality is a lever to look into the problem, but not necessarily the only lever. But how do we think about it both from a gender equality perspective and layer on economics as well as racial injustice, et cetera, to come up with these new solutions? And so we've been working to really think about how you do that, and have built our center up to initially provide these kinds of services. So just to give you an example of what does it look like, how do we start to think about these huge SDGs, right? You think about global gender equality as one. How do you actually break it down where it doesn't feel so overwhelming that you feel paralyzed for inaction? And so a lot of the work that we do is to really take a systems and an intersectional feminist approach to these challenges, and think about how do we break it down to think about new solutions. And so one of our biggest partners is with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And just to give you kind of examples of what would we actually do, what does this mean, how are we actually trying to change systems, is that we work with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to think about like a sector, for example, like water and sanitation, where historically we're trying to build new systems or new toilets. And how do we think about the implications of where fundamental inequalities intersect with that sector, bring the data and evidence and research to show that, and be able to translate it into meaningful practice. So not only at a strategic level, but you can't be designing systems unless you actually understand the fundamental population that you're trying to do. And how do we bring together diverse populations to break these silos, but then also come together for new solutions, but also acknowledging kind of the historical nature of a lot of these power dynamics within the systems, both from a donor perspective of we're the donor, therefore we know the solution, or we're Stanford, therefore we know what needs to happen in X country or in X community. But how do we co-design these things in new ways that also challenge the ways in which we hold power, how we think about how data and evidence is used, but then also who and how are we bringing new partners to the table? So I will pass it. So thank you for the opportunity.
Awesome, thank you. Ms. Edminster.
Thank you. Nice to be here, and I have just a few slides I wanted to walk through with you. So it's a lovely evening and a fun topic about accelerating. So my focus of my work is these days on building electrification, which means getting fossil fuels out of buildings to eliminate their greenhouse gas emissions. In homes, this means replacing typically 4 different types of equipment. So we're eliminating gas furnaces, replacing them with electric heat pumps, gas water heaters with electric heat pump water heaters, gas clothes dryers with electric dryers, either heat pump or conventional electric, and replacing gas ranges, again, with either conventional electric or induction cooktops. So that's kind of what it is. And then moving to the intersection with the Sustainable Development Goals, there are actually a lot. All of the ones that are not faded back are relevant, but I'm just going to highlight 4, starting with climate action. Building electrification is climate action because it dramatically reduces the greenhouse gas emissions for the remaining life of the building when we decarbonize. Secondarily, renewable energy. again, this process involves transitioning away from fossil fuels to clean renewable energy. And in many cases, when we talk about building electrification, we are adding renewable energy on site. Alternatively, in California, as probably many of you know, many jurisdictions have available to them 100% clean energy or very close to it, either as a premium service from the local utility or through a community choice aggregator, which is a term all of you might not be familiar with, but I'll jet ahead and we can cover that if it comes up as a question. The third SDG that comes into play here that's quite important is the good health. This is because when we eliminate combustion appliances from the home, we're also eliminating the byproducts of combustion. When we burn those fossil fuels in our homes, they produce byproducts that are very deleterious to human health and are implicated in asthma and many other serious health and particularly respiratory problems. And then finally, sustainable cities and communities, SDG number 11. The reality is that while we typically have been working on this at building scale, we actually need to scale up to the community and city scale, because one building at a time isn't going to get us where we need to go quickly enough to achieve our state and global climate goals. So that's kind of the picture there. And then shifting to the theme of this panel, shifting mindsets. I love this Henry David Thoreau quote, "What is the use of a house if you haven't got a tolerable planet to put it on?" And I think this really sets the mindset that I think we really need, which is we need to have a change in our sensibilities past what our personal preferences are, past I want to cook on a gas stove, or I want my gas barbecue or fireplace and so forth. We have to not allow that any longer to take precedence over the need for the collective good. And of course, the challenge here in terms of mindsets is we also have the fossil fuel gas industry that is working very hard to keep mindsets oriented on gas is good. So this is a real challenge for scale. And then the other aspect of mindset that I think is arguably most important is that we have to understand that unless we invest into our climate priorities, we won't shift behaviors and greenhouse gas emissions. So now moving on to shifting systems. When we're dealing with building electrification, there are so many different systems and subsystems that we deal with. And I've shown some of them here, which I think most of them are fairly self-explanatory, and I could probably spend a whole day talking about any one of these, but I'm just going to say a few words about mobilizing. What I mean by that, again, is mobilizing at city or community scale, which means allocating budget to the task. For example, I live in a town of about 60,000, where several $1 million have recently been allocated to resurfacing tennis courts, which is grand. I play tennis. However, where I really think it probably should go is into electrifying the space heating and water heating in low-income households that have been marginalized by many of our systems. So that's just a really, really quick overview of building electrification and where it sits at the intersection of the SDGs, shifting mindsets and shifting systems. So thank you, and for allowing me to do that express presentation.
Fantastic, Anne. Thank you so much. Now we'll start with a couple of generative questions and also be taking questions from the audience. To begin, how do we need to transform the mindsets of particularly business and policy leaders in your respective fields in order so that your businesses fields can play a greater role in advancing SDGs? Oh, Ms. Sun, you're muted.
Thank you so much. We talked about the environmental sustainability. I also want to echo with Sarah on the gender equality. I am the only female CEO in the high-tech industry in China. So I feel tremendous responsibility to really lay out a solid foundation for our female leadership team. What we do is very progressive. During the one-child policy period, our company is against it. So when our employee have the second child, we'll pay for the penalty that the government imposes. Now we have two-child policy and open up the population policy. We even take further steps to support our female leaders. When they're pregnant, we offer free taxi to take them to work and bring them home. When the baby is born, we give them 800 as a gift, 3,000 as education fee. When they come back to work, we offer flexible working hours. And now I realize lots of female students are getting their PhDs, study overseas. So when they come back to work, they struggle a little bit whether to have babies first or family first or work first. So then we come up with a policy that if our female workers choose to have their eggs frozen, our company will pay for it. And we are the first company and only company in China who does that. And I had to stand in front of the national media to defend our policy. And I told them, it's not, we are not supporting family, but every female is struggling with the biological clock because after a certain age, they will have difficulty having babies. So having this option for our female workforce really empowers them to have longer period to balance out work and life. So all these measures are very effective. So I highly echo with Sarah on her initiatives on gender equality. And as a result, more than 50% of the workforce is females. More than 40% are middle management managers and above. More than 1/3 of our executives, VP above, are females. So that number is a demonstration of the effectiveness of our policy. So because Trip.com is the largest travel company in China, in Asia, and even in the world, we work very closely with our government just to make sure our ideas, our proposals are very well heard of. And on the PR efforts and the GR efforts, whenever we have a chance, we also promote our ideas to promote gender equality, to promote sustainable travel. And that is very much in line with a lot of leaders' vision. So we want to keep our efforts. And I'm so glad we have this opportunity to share with the audience who have the same interests as ours. I'm very sure together we can do this.
Thank you.
I'd love to just add on a little bit as well to this, because I always am challenged by this question of scale, because we get it a lot in global development, and it's I challenge it all the time, because what are we scaling towards? And usually what we're trying to do when we talk about scale is cut a corner to say, how do we get something to as many people? And usually if it's not well designed or well thought out, we lose quality along the way. And then particularly when we're talking about changing fundamental structures or normative behavior, right? You can have unintended consequences if you actually don't think about things and you don't scale. And when you're talking about fundamental issues. And so I guess there's also to the question of how do we tackle these questions of scale, because they're fascinating, because I'm really only interested. I think we're in a moment in time, we can't be playing around the margins. We can't be, piloting another project. This requires massively big ambition, big new collaborations, big new ideas. And I think that's why we took on partnering with the Gates Foundation, because this idea of they're giving away $5 billion a year in essentially investments to make the world, especially in global health and development, towards the sustainable development goals. And our thinking was, if we can partner with them, bring the data and evidence, and quote unquote, make the business case again. I'm so tired of making the business case for fundamental human rights, but I'm like, all right, look, how do we make the business case to show that the data and evidence actually shows that if you address gender inequalities in the design of programs, it actually leads to better impacts to what you care about it leads to improving the world in terms of gender equality, climate change, and you can mitigate unintentional harm. And gender equality does not equal women and girls. Gender equality is everybody, and men and boys also benefit for gender equality and are also limited by the box that we put them in terms of society. So it's everybody's issue, everybody benefits from it. But the whole fundamental idea of how do you pick the levers within the system? Philanthropy is huge with the SDGs. We've got to figure out new ways to work. We've got to fundamentally address these issues in the design, in new innovative models and new systems. We've also got to attack it from the private sector. So we are now working with private sector companies to think about what does it actually look like to have gender equality beyond the normal or the typical of how many women are in positions. And you know, Mrs. Sun, is so impressive to have women like you in these leadership positions, but how do we make that more of the norm and not necessarily just have more women? How do we create environments and cultures that allow women to thrive and not just survive? So it's the norm and not the, you know, exemplar. And so we've been trying to take on these bigger projects that have higher levers in the system, that if we're actually mentally able to fundamentally change the ways in which the paradigms are thought about, designed differently, the potential impact is amplified. And so what are those levers? How do we strategically partner, and how can we build these examples that then can be scaled because we built replicable models and different ways of doing things? So I love this question. I get so excited because I think there's so much new frontier to be able to be looking across sectors, across industries to really think about this stuff in new ways. It's super exciting.
Fantastic, thank you.
So being on an all-female panel, I cannot resist saying that I think we could solve a lot of problems faster if we had more women like the two of you doing what you're doing.
I agree.
Yeah, well, it is a very fundamental problem, right? Because women are going to keep having the babies and they're going to keep being sidelined for a certain amount of their professional careers. And yeah, it's challenging. So I really appreciate what you all are doing. But I was also just reflecting back on sort of the leverage points, and I caught the tail end of the last panel where one of the speakers mentioned the importance of voting. And this is one of the things I've really been emphasizing in a lot of my work lately, is people say, well, what can we do? And I said, well, I think we need to get out of the notion that what we can do about climate and environment and sustainability only happens at home and at work. It also happens in the civic realm. And so voting is the beginning, but it's also really important for everyone to be heard by their town councils and planning bodies, you know, whether it's at a city level, regional level, state level, because all of these governmental bodies are much more responsive to their constituents, and they're much more nimble in their decision making than federal bodies. And so there's really, I think this is something that was evident in the prior administration in the US, that where federal action was not happening on climate, and the cities basically said, and some of the states said, we're going to take over. And I think this is it's a really important message, and it's wonderful to see cities from really pretty small ones up to major cities. I know, for example, Vancouver and London, New York, and a number of other international cities are really at the forefront of climate action and tackling these issues at scale. So very excited about that.
Fantastic, Anne, thank you. Our next question, an audience question. COVID has caused sweeping changes in areas as wide-ranging as work and food delivery. How has COVID impacted your projects, and where has it provided opportunity to advance change in your field?
Love to take this one on. Or go ahead, please, Susan.
Oh, no, please, Sarah, please.
So Well, one, I mean, it's also this very weird reality, right? It's rocked everybody's world. I mean, from our own individuals to the ways in which we interact with others, to partnerships, to et cetera. And I would say it's been a massive opportunity in the same way, is that this massive opportunity to build back differently the systems that we had. It always drives me nuts. See people and oh, we're going to go back to normal, and I'm like, in the United States, if normal is mass shootings, like they're not. This isn't normal. This is not normal. It wasn't. The systems weren't built for everybody. How do we do it differently? This is an opportunity to think and redesign. And I'll give you an example. So we were doing we were doing a big grant with the Gates Foundation right before COVID hit, and the idea behind this grant was, can you support giving pledge level philanthropists to think strategically about how do they incorporate an intersectional feminist gender equality perspective in their philanthropies? Can you help them think through this with a grant, right? So then I get a call right after COVID hits, and it's like, you know what, Sarah, all the big philanthropies are moving all of their money into COVID-19 response, PPE, which again, great thing to do, applaud them, but I just, no, yes, and if we don't actually take a fundamental intersectional analysis to the problem, that money that's going to COVID-19 responses is going to be ineffective. Not only are you going to be leaving impact on the table, you won't be getting the impact. You'll be increasing the inequalities that already exist. If we're not looking to who you're manufacturing, who is actually going to be receiving those things, that if we don't actually do that in the design, what an amazing opportunity to use this grant to come alongside and co-design these investments in COVID-19 through a true equity lens. And so I give that because it was such a neat example of, like, we in the global development, especially with the SDGs, it's like, what's the hot thing right now? And then all the funding goes there and the energy there. And then we turn our focus, because there are all of these massive problems. And it's such a cool opportunity to think too, they're all intersected. And if we keep taking, one part of the body off at a time, we'll never fix the whole. And so it's also an opportunity to say, we're fundamentally need to rethink these things with this true lens. And so I think in many ways, it's an incredibly challenging time, but also a time, this is the time where we break through and say, no, we're doing it differently. We're going to go big. It's the only way. We got to save our environment. It's the only planet we have. And we can't talk about gender on one day and climate change on the next and sustainable communities. They're all interrelated. And we have to start coming up with things that solve for all of them. Otherwise, we're going to continue to work on the margins.
Anne or Jane, would you like to build off of that?
Yeah, I think I echo with Sarah. Whenever we have a crisis, it's the best time for us to rethink the model and make giant leap. During COVID, nobody can travel. Obviously, the industry took the very hard impact from COVID. However, we put a lot of museums online, attractions online. So even without going abroad, the children sitting in their home will be able to learn from these wonderful heritages collected by different countries. So that's on the leisure side. The second piece is on the business side. Now, one-on-one meetings are very much durable through Zoom. So there are a lot of savings we can do through that. Although 100 mice type of convention is very difficult to do. But again, we took the advantage of people sitting in their office, in their home, and promote a lot of mission we have promoted, such as sustainability for your travel, gender equality when you are in the working places. And we really took this opportunity to advance our agenda forward and got lots of good response through the time that is not very congested for the people who are always on road, make people really think about what we can do going forward.
Well, it's really funny because I have so many different thoughts about things that have been different, and again, arguably in some better ways, and a lot of them again have this gender slant. So I think, for example, now both moms and dads are home with kids, and on meetings, Zoom meetings, I'll equally see both being interrupted by their kids. But one thing that's fabulous is it's kind of removed that veneer of we have to be different people at work than we are at home, and really humanized, and I think made a lot more tolerance of what it means to be parenting at work. So that's tremendously important. In my work realm, particular, not so much building electrification, but thinking about transportation electrification and human-powered mobility. One of the things that's happened in our community is COVID has created the opening for the city to do things like close streets for people to use for pedestrian and biking and gathering, a social context where that would not have happened. It could have been years before we would have achieved that type of approach to very informal, complete streets, right? Which has been a theme that's been bandied about for years, but doesn't really get much traction very fast. We now have several complete streets in our town. So that's been really interesting. And another one that relates to meetings that I think is really interesting, because I spend a lot of my time in meetings, is that in one sense, it's frustrating because we can't gather in person, and that arguably in many ways is more effective. But on the flip side, it's enabled people to participate when they have technology, and so many people have phones, that it's democratized participation in the civic realm in a way where we're seeing different people show up at meetings because they don't have to find childcare, they don't have to deal with transportation issues, they don't have to worry about getting home late. So that's been really, really positive, I think, for just having more voices in the conversation and beginning to again shift mindsets about what it takes to have more voices in the conversation about climate and about cultural change. So that part's really exciting. So I'm on a local climate commission, and we just recently added 2 youth commissioners, one of whom is only an 8th grader who's amazingly smart and forthright, and we don't have to worry about how he is going to get to the meeting, right? It's, he can't drive, it's across town, and it takes nobody any time to get anywhere, unless you're fighting with Zoom issues, of course.
And I just want to echo it. This has also been an interesting thing. It's forced us to live these kind of values where we say we would be more inclusive if, and we'd always had all these barriers. If we could get them from that country to this conference and the visa issues. And it's also it's allowed us to start to live these values that we talk about all the time of like, dismantling oppressive systems and how do we share power? And it's like, I'm looking at a grant that I have to work with the Ethiopian government. Why do I need to fly our North American experts to Ethiopia? Why aren't I shifting that money to local Ethiopian experts and backstopping them? Why haven't we done this a long time ago? And so it's forced us also, even our models for thinking of who's the expert and what do we add value, we add different value. And I think that this is such an exciting part too, where you can be more inclusive because there are these ways that you can have a global meeting, you can have these big Zoom meetings. I know we're all exhausted of them, but it can also change our behavior and the ways in which we frame how we solve for things now, right? That's very cool to think, I don't need to be at this global meeting. No, we can find the local individuals and groups that should be leading this, and how do we support them to go forward and take these on? And so it's also been a really neat opportunity to shift behavior for us as well.
Yeah. As I heard a wonderful presentation recently by a planner in Portland who had previously worked in San Francisco, and he was invited to speak to our local group about their climate action initiatives in both cities. And it was really interesting because he contrasted the two. He said, in San Francisco, what they did is they took a sort of an outward, almost an little promotion campaign where they, plastered messages about climate all over the side of city buses and so forth. And it was very much, and, again, we're telling you sort of what you should be doing about climate. What he said in Portland, we flipped that. And instead, we channeled the resources into grassroots groups and basically facilitated them deciding what they needed to do for their constituents. And it's exactly what you're talking about. But again, this operating more in a virtual context really does even further facilitate that. So I thought that was a wonderful compare and contrast story and very effective.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much. Another question from the audience. When you're making recommendations, starting up initiatives, how do you balance these projects so that they're cost effective, sustainable, and also take into account the needs of multiple stakeholders?
I can take a try. Whenever we have a project, we have to prioritize by running a model. We call it ROI model, return on investment. A lot of time, the return is only calculated by direct income rather than intangible income. So we try very hard to assign values for the social contribution we make for ESG. So for example, if you are able to reduce the carbon emission in a way, we don't see it on companies' P&L, but it's very good for the society. So we need to evaluate these kind of investment as well. So in our leaders' mind, not only we calculate the return by the direct income from to our company, but also how much our society benefits from these initiatives. That is the calculation we need to run. And based on the ROI, we prioritize different projects and deploy different technology resources to establish projects and move forward.
It's a great question. I'm like giggling in my head. I was like, oh, I don't know if we are doing a good job of balancing all of the priorities, because I think, I think we do a good job in efficiency and building, but it's also this like, this passion, right? Where it's also like, there's so much impact, and how do we prioritize partners? And some of the ways that we've started to think about this too is that, looking at the opportunities where we have to partner, and again, taking that real lens on where do we have an opportunity to really make systems change through tangible actions, and starting to pick those partners that, man, if we moved this ship 30 degrees, we've unlocked these kinds of resources or this kind of social change impact. And so we've been really thinking about designing kind of where we put our energies, because we're limited. I mean, we've also built kind of a neat model at Stanford, which is unique. In that, so we have our group, our center, which again, we became official in June of last year, but we've been working together for a long time. But we've built like a core group of like 20 team members within our center. But what we built is we call our stable of unicorns, which is like the way that I love to refer to it. But they're global experts across the globe, from gender equality and climate change, gender in supply chains, gender, in community development. And so when we get a big kind of hairy challenge from the Gates Foundation or from one of our other partners, say, help us figure out how we do this, we can take our core team at Stanford and then supplement from this amazing group of experts globally to kind of build the A team to say, how do we tackle this challenge from these different perspectives and from these different approaches? And so that's kind of we've been thinking about, what are these new, more adaptive models that allow us not to kind of have a response in a box, quite frankly, which I think has been part of the challenge in global development and with the SDGs. Is we developed this like beautiful program that we developed in Seattle or Palo Alto, and we're going to take it to this rural community. And then we're like, it didn't work. Like we didn't get the results that we were expecting. And so it's just allowed us to think about, how do we change those? Who's at the table? How do we share our resources? How do we think about resourcing? And then how do we, take the adequate will to step back and out of the way to say, wow, what we're really good at is getting you guys the money and the funding to do it. And so it's been this really interesting of thinking about our model of efficiency. Where's the best use of our time? And then what's our role given something? And then where do we say, we're really good at the ideation and getting it. We're not the implementers. This needs to go to this other group, and how do we support them to be successful? So again, it's kind of linked into how do we think about kind of new models for building efficiency, but also leveraging what we can be good at, and then making sure that we're bringing in others, so we're not replicating what's already amazing work that's already happening out there.
Well, it's really kind of interesting because what Sarah is saying is in a very different realm of work from mine, actually very much mirrors the work that I do too, which is, yeah, you have a big gnarly question, and what you want to do is not try and answer it yourself, but bring together the best minds available to wrestle with it together. And what's kind of interesting about that is that means in my industry, sometimes you can pull that off on a voluntary basis, but sometimes you have to pay people, and you have to pay them top dollar for that. But it's actually efficient use of the resources, because then you get really good solutions instead of wrestling with maybe half-baked solutions for a lot longer, at a lot lower dollar per bad solution. So it's really important, I think, to take an integrated approach. And I see that both sort of at a sort of high level, like how do you put together a program, which is a lot of what I do, is putting together education programs within the building industry and bringing those greater minds to, not only consulting with them individually, but getting them to knock their heads together on certain things, right? But then we also use that on individual building projects and figuring out, like, wow, if we're going to accomplish all these really challenging goals on a given building, we want to do the same thing, where normally building design happens in a very sequential handoff manner. We say, no, we actually want everybody at the table at the same time, because you all bring different bodies of experience on different projects, in addition to your different disciplines and just the way different brains work, right? Mm-hmm. And so we work through those solutions together, having all the perspectives at once. And it's, what a colleague of mine has a saying that I really like, which is, nature isn't efficient, nature is abundant. And so it's kind of works on that principle, right? We bring the abundance of the resources together, and what's produced is ideally beautiful, as nature is, coming out of abundance, as opposed to trying to pare it away to a really slim set of resources and still get something brilliant out of it. Doesn't typically happen.
Fantastic, thank you. Unfortunately, we are coming to the end of our panel. So I want to thank you all so much. Anuheya will close this out.